So tonight's presenter is Dr. Patrick Dobson, and I am honored to present him. He is my colleague at Johnson County Community College. Patrick received his PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City in 2013. His dissertation is entitled More Than a River, Using Nature for Reform in the Progressive Era, and in it he uses irrigation and settlement in the West to construct a social history about changing attitudes towards nature and human relationships. But Patrick was an accomplished and published, which is a really big thing for us academics, published author long before his PhD. He has had success not just as an academic writer, but also as a poet, an investigative reporter, and a fiction writer. His work has appeared in the Kansas City Star, the Mid-America Poetry Review, the National Catholic Reporter, and The Pitch, among other publications. The excellence of his published work has been acknowledged by numerous organizations, including the Catholic Press Association, the Kansas City Press Club, the National Newspaper Association, and the Kansas City Association of Black Journalists. In 2009, the University of Nebraska Press published Seldom Seen, A Journey into the Great Plains, Patrick's account of a walking journey he took through the Midwest from Kansas City, Missouri to Helena, Montana. It is a wonderful book. I recommend everybody read it. The book was a finalist for the High Plains Book Award and was an honorable mention for the Byron Caldwell Smith Book Award and the Thorpe Men Award for Literary Excellence. Later this year, a book about his return journey by canoe on the Missouri River, entitled Canoeing the Great Plains, A Missouri River Summer, will be published again by the University of Nebraska Press. But conservation is not just an academic question for Patrick. He also has firsthand knowledge of what it means to work the land. He has been involved in various neighborhood garden initiatives in Westside Kansas City. He has worked in an apple orchard, a butterfly garden, an organic garden, and as a beekeeper, which I don't think you've ever told me in all the times we've had chats in my office. And I'm a little upset about that because that's fascinating. I believe these hands-on experiences inform his academic work and deepen his understanding of the historical significance of American attitudes towards nature and conservation. Finally, Patrick is a certified iron worker and an adjunct professor at the Johnson County Community College History Department. It is a true privilege to work with this accomplished and endlessly fascinating human being. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Dobson.
Well, thanks for being here for me tonight. For all you students taking extra credit, getting extra credit, be sure to take a few notes. I'm going to dive right into my paper. I'm going to use slides, perhaps sporadically. We'll have to figure out how that goes because the number of players that are in this paper, as well as what they do, is pretty complicated. So I hope that you can stay with me, and I'm sure that if you don't, I'll be able to see that you're ready for me to stop talking. In 1908, this man here, John Neihardt, embarked on a journey down the Missouri River. He based his 1910 book, The River and I, on articles that Putnam's magazine published a year earlier. He recounted much more than a personal journey. His writing style combined journalism, poetry, and literary realism. With them, Neihardt delivered a full-throated articulation of progressive perceptions of nature's utility. Nature was useful, at least in Neihart's view, for individual and social improvement. He depicted himself as a modern American man. He set out on the river to find more of himself through vigorous physical encounters with nature. At the same time, Neihardt portrayed the river as a mechanism for national economic and imperial expansion. He advocated for government-sponsored river development. He sought to reactivate the river as a manly workspace and create new commercial possibilities for a nation entering a period of material and cultural progress. Neihardt was not alone in seeking new ways to implement nature in developing manhood and the nation as a whole. The conservationist impulses of writer and adventurer Casper Whitney, big game hunter Madison Grant, and President Theodore Roosevelt arose from a desire to improve the American male. Manipulation of the physical environment and its non-human inhabitants secured the country's economic future. These men urged white males to use outdoor activities to improve themselves. This was their duty to God and country. Contact with nature, competitive sports, and adventurism at home and abroad tested men's mettle and proved the superiority of the white race. These activities remade milquetoast men subsumed in consumer materialism into Americans who possess good character and nationalistic vigor. The definitions of progress, of course, depended on who interpreted them and for what purpose. These players who advocated new uses for natural environment, I will mention some of them, but I want to focus on contemporaries John Neihardt, irrigation propagandist William Ellsworth Smythe, and Senator Francis Griffith Newlands. These men believed that the United States had become a technologically and economically advanced nation. Because of this, it had been ordained to take its place at the top of the hierarchy of nations. To them, progress embodied a sense of national destiny and a broad notion of social improvement. Progressive ideas of the environment's importance ran such a gamut of theory and practice that examination of another set of reformers would produce a very different narrative from the one I'm going to give you now. I will also not attempt to specify or itemize the practical results of Neihardt and Smythe's ideas or of Newland's various legislative initiatives. I do, however, want to use the idea of these men, to show the ways American views and attitudes toward the natural environment shifted during the progressive era, particularly in light of social reform. For each of these men, Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands, the advent of modern industrialism endangered the terms of material progress. Rank consumerism debased the middle-class male. It denigrated values upon which the country was built. Left unattended, urban squalor and poverty, as well as the loss of entrepreneurial spirit, despoiled American manhood and white racial superiority. Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands believed that immigration and urban growth attenuated traditional moralities. Immigrants in cities deteriorated human bonds and community relationships. Only positive action on the part of right-minded, disciplined people could carry forth the march of American civilization. For Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands, nature held the key to continued national progress. These men and others like them believed in science, technology, and problem solving. They proselytized a faith that rational alteration of the physical environment bent modern capitalism to positive social purposes. Proper uses of nature promised to alleviate social ills. Use of the physical environment oriented the nation to the proper course for the future. That is, these men believed that human beings could alter the natural environment with will. Their labor and correct principles could determine the trajectory of the nation. Enlightened human action in nature, they thought, accommodated social changes. It maintained and even strengthened traditional values in human relationships. Reformers, conservationists, and moralists at the turn of the 20th century understood the city and its influence on American life differently. If human geographies built the city, reformers such as Roosevelt and Newlands reasoned that nature must be the key to combating urban social problems. Nature was the solution to middle-class male malaise. Women were beginning to take new places in society and home by their own power and accord. Roosevelt and Neihardt believed men had to rise to the occasion. Neihardt saw the outdoors as a place of honest, wholesome endeavor. It offered comfort and release for the urban masses. The natural environment taught lessons of fortitude that the urban environment could not. Contact with nature strengthened the man's resolve. It plied his body with healthful exertions and toughened his character for participation in competitive capitalism. Adventurers like Neihardt and Roosevelt set out to encounter raw nature in brash demonstrations of manhood. Most reformers, however, offered milder versions of the outside to their charges and those they wanted to attract to the outdoor life. Conservationist Madison Grant, who, by the way, was a vehement eugenicist, a guy who really believed that only certain people should breed for the benefit of society. Madison Grant and a group of like-minded enthusiasts brought nature to city dwellers. They built institutions like the Bronx Zoo, and they expanded the New York Aquarium. The artificial prairies, forests, and streams of the zoo and the aquarium embodied lessons for modern society, they thought. At the same time, agrarianist Liberty Hyde Bailey and educator Anna Botsford Comstock endorsed nature study for Americans' physical and moral health. Progressive conservationist George Bird Grinnell helped establish and later headed the Audubon Society. The organization advocated nature education and bird study as a means of building good citizenship. From 1890 to 1911, Grinnell also edited the influential Forest and Stream magazine. The magazine promoted contact with nature and wildlife conservation. Ethnologist and writer James Willard Schultz utilized the Missouri River in his adventure tales. Such stories bolstered ideas of nature as central to American history and culture. Schultz's stories later appeared in book form in a book called Floating on the Missouri River. In this book, he combined history, landscape, and Native American culture to frame his ideas of the physical environment's importance to modern cultural life. Ideas of empire preoccupied many progressives at the turn of the century, but so did conservation of manhood, and frequently reformers conflated these two themes. Reformers sought to reaffirm manhood as an integral component of a new, uniquely American kind of overseas empire. Roosevelt, for instance, believed that military duty and war counteracted the softening of the body and character that came with steady, routinized work. He engaged in military adventurism during the Spanish-American War. While the aging Roosevelt sought to reaffirm his own standing and reputation, he was 41 when the beginning of the Spanish-American War, so he was really kind of old to be a soldier prancing around on a horse in the Cuban countryside. But he also held himself up as a man, as a man in trying times, what a man should be doing in trying times. The idea of empire related directly to notions of manifest destiny, particularly to men. Neihardt wrote of his manly fur trappers and his connections to them at a time when men like Roosevelt feared that routine work and increased parity with women feminized the American man. Such softening of the American male lowered his status and made him into a timid companion in the home. Such a state of affairs dealt blows to the traditional family and set the stage for national decline. Women were gaining influence in American society through female suffrage and new roles in the home and at work. Men had to take more, be more, live larger. At the same time, they had to understand their duties at home. If due to age, business, or family circumstances, men could not bring democracy to their brown brothers in Central and South America and to Asia and the Pacific, they could still meet their call with industrial and moral support for those fighting to expand American power overseas. In addition, Roosevelt believed men at home should assert their power in strenuous activity for the good of themselves, for the good of American manhood, and for an ordered and predominantly white society. Casper Whitney, like Roosevelt, philosopher and psychologist William James, and author Jack London extolled the virtues of the strong white male engaged in strenuous activity. An adventurer, Whitney wrote of rough encounters with nature, from snowboarding, listen to that. He was snowboarding in the Arctic in 1905. From snowshoeing in the Arctic to chopping through the East Asian jungles. These journeys took place mostly on rivers. Notable among them were the tributaries and main stems of the Amazon, Orinoco, and Rio Negro. He took these trips not to report on the natives or to hunt exotic animals. He did a lot of that. But he undertook his travels, he said, solely to satisfy the horizon hunger which incites me every now and then to go and see things. His underlying motive was to show, he said, the flight of a spirit that would be free from the crying newsboys and the pressure of conventions, in a word, the lust for adventure. Whitney also offered average domestic men an alternative to overseas travel. He went to England to experience the democratic sportingness of the British. His mission, he wrote, was to report on the British traditions and systems of sport to his American readers. He wrote, "The average Britisher is an athlete. The English nation is an athletic one, and its subjects, both men and women, more universally and genuinely imbued with the spirit than those of any other race on earth." Now, if anybody knows Brits, I'm not sure that that would be an apt sort of description. However, Whitney certainly saw that British competitive sport was something that Americans should be taking up at the turn of the century. Using himself and his observation for authority, Whitney sought to demonstrate the joys and physical exertions of organized sport and outdoor adventure. He reasoned that American men had been, quote, too thoroughly preoccupied with the building of a great nation, end quote, to pay much attention to sport as a release from tedium and a teacher of competitive values. Sport, he wrote, makes manly boys and gentle men, puts pluck in the heart and strength in the body. Now, Whitney and Roosevelt became close personal acquaintances. They shared a belief in the benefits of what we now know as the strenuous life, or what Roosevelt actually called the strenuous life, and its therapeutic effects on the American male creature. Strenuous living, they believed, gave middle-class men self-confidence and physical and moral strength. In this conception of male achievement, physical challenge strengthened the individual male and reaffirmed his place in the leadership of modern society. While Roosevelt fought wars and safaried, Whitney chopped his way through jungles and advocated competitive sport. In the meantime, John Neihardt set himself up as a man who overcame challenges and delighted in his accomplishments on a uniquely American river. In showcasing his travails and successes, he positioned his tale within the strenuous living ideal that Roosevelt advocated. He offered travel on the river as an intense experience that freed the work and city-bound from routine and empty lives. As such, the river protected and invigorated American men. It encouraged the entrepreneurial spirit and adapted men to the new realities of an industrial society. Much in the way that Roosevelt, Whitney, and other reformers advocated intense experience and contact with nature, Neihardt showcased the river as an answer to the problems that ailed the modern American man. Conservationists, social progressives, and preservationists also responded in different ways to the anxiety they felt as they watched wild spaces disappear under bulldozer, shovel, and saw. With confidence in their technological prowess, conservationists set about restructuring the environment for long-term economic benefit. Theodore Roosevelt and his head of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, sought to constrain commercial exploitation of natural resources. The very survival of American business and democracy depended on it. The bureaucratic institutions that scientists and government experts organized put new controls on corporate behavior in the wild. Scientific management, bureaucratic organization, and expert planning, they believed, best replaced old and wasteful economic exploitation of nature with new economic and social efficiencies. With new rules concerning wildlife, land, and water, government and private conservationist organizations streamlined commercial, value-driven behavior into restructured avenues of investment and return. Around the same time, the development of the industrial city and the closing of the frontier moved such people as John Muir to promote new appreciation for the nation's remaining and seemingly pristine natural spaces. Muir believed that natural spaces provided escape from the rigors of modern life. He advocated saving some resources and landscapes in or lightly touched condition, particularly where allegedly pristine nature still existed in the West. One of the things that I want to point out before I go on is that John Muir posed places like Yosemite and Yellowstone as pristine. But in the end, people had actually been living there for something like 30,000 years. So for us to think that Yellowstone is nature without man or nature without human beings is something of a misnomer, and it actually comes out of this particular period when these guys really thought, we're going to save the pristine environment, we're going to kick out all the natives, and then have something left for us in the end. Conservationist organizations such as the Boone and Crockett Club, which gathered Roosevelt, Grinnell, Grant, and Pinchot under one organizational roof, sought to control the behavior of market hunters. They wanted to root out individual adventurers and people living at the fringes of society. They sought to conserve domestic animal species, and they wanted to do this to secure the long-term ability for middle and upper-class men to prove themselves in the hunt. Wildlife protections limited the individual's conduct in the wild. Conservationists redefined activity in the outdoors to dovetail with their patriotic and often manly values of personal restraint and sportingness. Conservation included a broad variety of approaches to environmental management and alteration. Many conservationists pursued their priorities with the reform of a rapidly changing society in mind. Advances in technology, particularly those with industrial implications, helped fuel the growth of cities in the United States. Between 1890 and World War I, an overwhelming number of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe poured into cities, creating vast labor markets for American industrial concerns. To Chicago and the great eastern cities, immigrants brought language and cultural ways unfamiliar to native-born Americans. As cities mushroomed, living conditions for the poorest urbanites grew ever more squalid. A new kind of urban industrial poverty seemingly created criminality and intractable social ills. Prostitution, alcoholism, and drug abuse plagued American cities. Men, women, and even children worked unbearable hours at ill-paid jobs that demeaned traditional ideas of hard work and persistence. Nativist paroxysms imbued with a fervor to preserve what many believed was a white, Protestant, English-speaking society arose in response to the city's ill-defined influence on American culture. Labor capital unrest threatened to upset the economic advancement and introduce new kinds of property relationships. Despite the views of my subjects, Neihardt, Newlands, and Smythe, cities and immigrants did not by themselves pose threats to nationhood or manhood. Indeed, new immigrants, industrial workers, and chronically poor urbanites meted out their own social and economic relationships within the confines of the city and the ideological limits of the culture. Their adaptability and humanness, however, mattered little to people like Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands. These people looked on the city and its restless masses as stifling, dirty, and deleterious to American culture. These attitudes belong to more than the reformer activists of the progressive era. Now, I'm going to ask you to stretch just a little bit here because there's a dynamic that I want to introduce when it comes to reform in the progressive era, because these guys don't get anywhere without a popular audience. Many of the same Americans that Smythe and Newlands sought to reform and who Neihardt wanted to release from the city's grasp supported social reform efforts. The public often acted with moralism and racism to the faceless and abstract categories of people who lived in the same circumstances that they did. Such masses often included those who supported reform efforts. In other words, people often sought to reform others like themselves without including themselves in the category of people needing reform. This dual mindset formed a dynamic that perpetuated itself through cultural means. Like many other reformers, Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands believed that they knew best and spoke to broad constituencies who agreed with them. They idealized notions of personal responsibility and self-determination. Their ideas found a ready home in the ideologies of self-improvement that many Americans believed in and held dear. Their contemporaries in churches, the press, and business groups bemoaned the conditions in the city. They spoke to broad audiences of urban Americans who often shared concerns over the state of the nation. From their pulpits, clergy preached a return to traditional moralities as a solution to the city's moral and social conundrums. This message resounded with Americans drawn to the well-worn idea that declining morals caused national deterioration. Editorialists castigated the masses and urged them to reform themselves, a view that many Americans, even those living in cities, agreed with. Sociologists and social theorists, as well as eugenicists, formulated new theories that blamed immigrants and the poor for their own plights. This message appealed to broad constituencies in the city and in rural areas throughout the nation. Few of these hand-wringers, however, sought to destroy the city. Even fewer believed that they could return to an idealized and sentimentally remembered agrarian past. Instead, reformers, with the assent of their supporters, undertook legal remedies to remold and reform urban populations. Immigration restrictionists and urban reformers found audiences among workers, native, poor, and middle-class white Americans who supported immigration controls and labor laws. Through building codes, city planning, and increased urban services, such as law enforcement, parks, and sanitation programs, reformers tried to make urban life easier. They sought to build less toxic and more constructive ways toward gaining, again, traditional American social relationships. Still others sought community-based approaches to urban ills that included immigrants and the poor as part of their socializing apparatus. This resulted in the establishment of settlement houses, broad-based political reforms, and business regulations. Within this milieu of ideas, Neihardt, Smythe, and Newland's notions represented a larger context of reform through the reutilization of the country's natural endowments. Each of these men interpreted the natural environment as a capital and social resource useful in social reform. They felt uneasy with the changing cultural and economic priorities among common Americans. They looked with concern on social and labor upheavals. In one way or another, they believed that immigrants' diminished faith in the Protestant work ethic or negatively influenced society's racial and cultural composition. Each perceived from their own standpoints that cities stifled individual initiative. Unskilled industrial labor offered little personal reward. They believed, along with a host of politicians, clergy, and cultural commentators, that industrial working environments and squalid living conditions in cities eroded Americans' belief in hard work, persistence, and personal independence. Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands also understood the challenges of the modern age, presented new opportunities to foster innovative working and social relationships, as well as profitable business opportunities. Often using similar rhetoric, they conveyed widely varying conceptions of how the natural environment countered such problems. They all believed that uses of nature counteracted growing social disorder and discontent among the urban working class. They shared a belief in the duty of the federal government to rearrange natural spaces for the social good. Neihardt and Smythe, in particular, assumed that contact with nature through water development and recreational aspects of conservationism allowed middle-class Americans relief from the pressures of industrial life. Newlands and Smythe maintained that scientific management of the natural environment and orderly conditions of investment and return went a long way in safeguarding the nation's long-term economic and social health. Neihardt is best remembered for his immensely popular book, Black Elk Speaks. While written in the 1930s, this book gained a following among young Americans in the 1960s, and I recommend it to all of the young Americans sitting right here. But the most popular work of his early career was The River and I. New York's Macmillan published the book as progressives engaged in these conversations about new roles for rivers and water in American social and economic life. Speaking to a broad American public, Neihardt wrapped the river and its environs in romantic and manly rhetoric. The river built sinew, intestinal fortitude, and character in the American male. At the same time, Neihardt willingly participated in a larger river improvement cause. The cause had developed in the Midwest in the 1880s and gained steam at the turn of the century. As the years went on, the river improvement advocates took on ideas of conservation and adapted them to improving the riverine environment for commerce. River improvement reopened the river to commerce and natural resource extraction. The River and I contained almost verbatim arguments of the river improvement advocates and conservationists interested in conserving water and rivers. He communicated that message to a broad popular audience. River improvement advocates argued that the federal government had subsidized railroads to the detriment of river transportation. The government, they reasoned, then had an obligation to alter the river, in a sense, standardize it for new water transportation technologies in order to offer railroads competition and ease conditions for business people and farmers in the American Midwest. Neihardt saw in an improved river promise of manly endeavor for the nation's male population. But river improvement advocates sought river development not for the average worker or yeoman farmer. They used the rhetoric of individual achievement, but they sought instead to open the nation's rivers to large shipping concerns that could fill deep draft barges with grain and freight. They used the idea of conservation as a coordinated and planned environmental endeavor in their arguments. But each business association, town booster, and individual businessman involved in river development did not really seek government help for the general public. They didn't think in terms of coordinated systems of river transport. They wanted government involved in river development for their own pecuniary interests. When it came to actual centralized planning and river development, river advocates resisted. Cities and individual businesses wanted their gains and profits above their competitors. Politicians repelled efforts to rein in their ability to bring home pork projects to their constituencies. Like Neihardt, irrigation activist William Smythe, and Nevada politician Newlands understood that Western water and rivers offered vast potential for national expansion. In the 1890s and 1900s, Smythe argued that the middle-class professional was the backbone of the modern economy and the foundation of civic life. He looked at the arid West and saw immense tracts of land just waiting for the touch of water. Farm life in desert spaces, he argued, offered physically and spiritually wholesome lifestyles. Fresh air, fresh, dry air, and plenty of sun invigorated tired souls and made people more amenable to democratic cooperative communities. In the West's arid regions, he imagined, Americans could carry out their moral obligation to finish God's work if they just put the will and the labor into it. He dreamed of new Edens, small, planned, and irrigated communities that molded middle-class professionals into gentlemen farmers. Some of Smythe's contemporaries considered him a careerist and a dreamer, as you might imagine, because Smythe is talking about the gentleman farmer without actually considering what kind of work farming really is. Conservation, however, took on just about any aspect of streamlining the environment for commerce, recreation, and hunting. Smythe's friendly critics saw his major work for the irrigation cause, a book called The Conquest of Arid America, as filled with exaggeration and bluster. These critics, however, were very pleased to have Smythe speak to a broad American public for them, and Smythe was happy to do it. With his grand pronouncements and rhetorical flourishes, Smythe promoted the conservationist irrigation ideal to make his own prosperous living. When he put his theories into practice, his irrigation colonies failed miserably. But by the time these utopias end up, he had already garnered his profits and trundled off to the next wildly successful speech. He wrote financially rewarding books on irrigation. He started personally lucrative but botched irrigation developments throughout California and into Idaho. Newlands and Smythe often ran in the same social and political circles. Newlands was a full-blown conservationist. He envisioned reclamation as part of a larger, centralized national project for national and imperial expansion. He argued that government experts and bureaucracies best planned water development projects. Such corporate organizations moved the rivers and stored the water. Bureaucrats parceled out the water based on shipping schedules, crop and rainfall estimations. They measured water in national economic needs. Water development in the West, Newlands argued, increased agricultural production and benefited national and international commerce. A successful water program for Newlands brought all water in the West together into a system of agricultural production and inland waterways. Newly irrigated land and managed rivers gave urban dwellers the ability to pursue new lives as agrarians, not in small communities as Smythe really advocated, but in large, planned, and organized commercial endeavors that fed systems of investment and return. Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands alike demanded the government take control of Western watercourses. With the election of Roosevelt in 1900, Smythe and Newlands found their old ally had become their most powerful advocate. Roosevelt looked to irrigation as a way to build a new constituency in the West, and he used his connections with Smythe and Newlands for just these purposes. Smythe and his ideas of desert utopias, however, took a backseat to Newland's centralizing programs. but Smythe was able to parlay his relationship with Roosevelt into new, profitable writing opportunities that furthered his career and kept his ideas relevant to an American public. Activist government lay at the heart of almost all conservationist goals. To gin up support for such use of government power, Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands positioned themselves and their ideas for public consumption. They wrote books, they penned newspaper and magazine articles, and their work articulated the cultural, political, and economic priorities of their time and society. Nature writing, adventure tales, and stories of manly exploit in nature frothed the pages of men's magazines, which were very popular at the time. Neihardt provided that kind of copy for audiences anxious for those kinds of stories. He endowed his articles and books with a personal sincerity that played well with his readers and displayed the depth of his inquisitive personality. As he looked back on history, he admired the hard-working fur trappers and rivermen. He practiced hero worship as he waxed poetic about steamboat captains and fur company emperors. A productive river, he also argued, combined nature's might, human labor, and American technological prowess into a perfect whole. In magazines and a series of popular and well-selling books, Smythe devoted himself almost wholly to selling irrigation as a cure for what ailed America. The cities trapped the middle-class professional, he believed. The city made him weak and exposed him to the temptations of consumerism. Flat-screen TVs, I guess. The cities also subjected the middle-class male to the will of faceless corporations and the social denigration that immigrant hordes brought with them. Smythe maintained that the victims of this new urban industrial world had no consciousness of their confinement. The baubles and luxuries of city life distracted them. According to Smythe, irrigating the desert solved these problems and many more. Water development demanded huge upfront investments, he argued, and only the federal government could muster the corporate and bureaucratic power to plan, coordinate, and pay for the irrigation apparatuses needed for larger and benevolent nationalistic goals. Francis Newlands worked in law, money management, and politics. His political career gained purchase in the silver and irrigation causes in California and Nevada. He targeted his remarks on Western water development and conservation in Congress from 1893 to 1917 to his death in 1917 toward business and political figures. As his influence grew, he gained a broader American public through magazine and newspaper articles. With an eye to the average American, he frequently used populist appeals to deeply held American ideologies of hard work and self-determination. For him, Smythe's Jeffersonian ideal was a useful rhetorical device that gained support for irrigation as a part of a smooth-functioning, corporatized economy. He envisioned irrigation as part of a larger comprehensive federal water policy that included all aspects of water conservation and river control. He believed Americans could use and develop their technological might with intentional alterations of rivers, lakes, and streams. He sought coordinated and large-scale agriculture, river transportation, and flood control. The federal government, with its finances and ability to organize technological and scientific expertise, created bigger, more efficient economies of scale. Water then secured the food supply, affected social and economic efficiency, and created orderly schemes of investment and return. Rapid changes in social life, technology, and science gave the American environment new social meanings and functions. What Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands would have called progress and conservation justified and indeed demanded more change and more progress. More progress created conditions for greater interaction with the natural environment. With dams, river channels, and flood control apparatus, Americans redirected the river's energies into systems of social and commercial power. In shaping the nation's water and rivers for particular ends, engineers, government bureaucrats, and social planners fashioned the outcomes that they intended, and many they did not. Technological advances generated and regenerated obsolescence. Science and business uncovered areas of underdevelopment and opportunities for new markets. All rivers, challenged engineers, elected officials, and businessmen's best ideas and efforts. Under human control, rivers flooded just as frequently as before, and rarely provided the economic gains that engineers, politicians, and government bureaucrats promised. In the manipulation of nature, however, Americans know no failure. They see only prospects for greater applications of human creativity and technology. Social conflicts show weakness in and chances for more social engineering. In the end, once we altered the environment for social purposes, we couldn't leave it alone. Our systems of economy, social organization, and government never really accommodate inaction, only more action, more technology, and more expert problem solving. Environmental philosopher Neil Smith wrote that, quote, in the constant drive to accumulate larger and larger quantities of social wealth under its control, capital transforms the shape of the entire world. No God-given stone is left unturned, no original relation with nature unaltered, no living thing unaffected. Neihardt, Smythe, and Newlands participated in this dynamic. They approved of it, and they supported it. For them all, utilizing nature for practical purposes subjugated and reformed restless masses. They believed this whether or not urbanites decided to move out of cities onto grids of orderly irrigated farms or find work in manipulated river environments. These men also maintained their faith whether or not mainstreamed water and rivers resulted in rational, reliable schemes of investment or absolute loss. Thanks for being here for me tonight. I hope we got something out of it. Thanks a lot. I really would like to have somebody ask me a question. One of our young, strong students up here could probably come up with one. Anybody from the audience, I would really love to take questions because that's the more extemporaneous part of the presentation, one I'm more comfortable with.
You said Sly's California irrigation thing was botched, but yet it was personally lucrative for him. How did that?
He made tons of money writing books about these utopias, sort of theoretical books about here's what could happen if we just watered the desert, right? If we just put more water on the desert, more people would be happy. And people loved it. They really ate that up. But they were people who weren't ever going to go out and farm a piece of ground, right? And the people who he could get to farm a piece of ground went out to his projects, and they bought their lots, and they did their bid, and they went broke. But he was already gone. He'd already collected all the money and left and gone on to the next successful book or speech. So that's how that works. Yes?
It seems like, we're still trying to create this utopia out there with water. And could you comment about this plan to divert and reserve river water, I think maybe as far west as California? Did I read that right?
Well, at least as far, from what I understand, at least as far as western Kansas, we have to pump it. If you think about that, we have to take Missouri River and pump it about half a mile into the sky to get water there. And actually, if we look at what your question is, the way that that's sold is on the backs of the small farmer ideal, right? If we could just get water to those farmers, then everything would be great. But what we know about water manipulation, particularly in the West, is that it does not create small farms. As a matter of fact, it creates larger farms and fewer farmers. And that's the way it's worked really since the turn of the 20th century, when we really began to build a lot of federal dams in the West. We actually have billion-dollar irrigation projects in the West that benefit 2 growers. So 2 corporations or 2 people who live in New York someplace. But there's thousands and thousands of almond trees, and we go to the Costco and we buy cheap almonds, right? So if we think about moving 4 billion gallons of water from the Missouri River to western Kansas, we have to think about what that's really going to mean in terms of environment, right? Is there going to be enough water in the river to float these boats that don't even float there, really? Then we have to think about what does that do to the western Kansas farmer? Who's going to pay for that? Most of our irrigation programs in the West represent billions of dollars of federal subsidies every year. And I find it ironic, really, to hear small government talk come out of these western regions where the federal government really is the biggest arm of anything that's there, right? So there's this centralized power and these orderly grids, but do they actually result in more gentleman farmers or more small farmers? They generally result in larger farms belonging to fewer corporations. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Is it possible, though? I mean, you think that's a possibility?
Oh, we could, yeah. I mean, we, in California, we take water out of the Sacramento River and pump it over a mountain range to get water to irrigate places in the Central Valley. So, yeah, getting it there, I mean, we could do that. That's us, right? We're all about technology. But we have to think about that a second. How long does that work, right? I mean, how many great schemes do we see that involve a lot of technology that actually last a long time? What is the cost of maintaining those things? And that's a question. And not only that, but it locks us into doing certain things. Right? If we build $1 billion or $4 billion or $10 billion irrigation project, we better make it work. And so we're locked into that behavior for a long time because we've built that kind of thing and we don't want it to go to waste. Strong students? Yes?
What would you say was the most significant impact
Of what?
of these three thinkers?
Of these three thinkers, we have, of course, John Neihardt is broadcasting the river improvement causes message. And we actually have, we feel that impact today in the way that the Missouri River and the Mississippi River are managed and controlled. With Smythe gave the rhetoric to Francis Newlands that he really used to create a whole new federal bureaucracy in the Bureau of Reclamation, which operates big dams that irrigate projects out in the West and create a lot of energy out in the West. As a matter of fact, the Colorado River is really a result of Francis Newland's National Reclamation Act of 1903. So you know that the Colorado River is basically used up by the time it gets to the middle of Arizona, and it dribbles out into the Gulf of Baja only on particular occasions. And actually, the United States is constantly in violation of a water treaty with Mexico because of the river has been not just parceled out, but parceled out 10 times over. So if we were going to meet all of our goals for the Colorado River, we'd have to have 10 times more water in the Colorado River in order to meet those goals, which is another problem, really, of this big centralized power. I mean, big organizations tend to look for reasons to continue to survive and grow, right? And the Bureau of Reclamation is, and ultimately also the Corps of Engineers, are two organizations that have done very well doing just that. But they get to do it because we love the small farmer, right? We don't really love the small farmer. We love cheap almonds, right? Yes?
It's interesting, but can you talk a little bit to the disconnect between what these guys propose as being somewhere out there away from the metropolis, when in fact almost all the metropolitan cities, the larger incentives, grew out of rivers. And yet the rivers in their own backyards are the one thing that they never looked at as managing for their own purposes in that kind of sense where you bring that general goodwill and positiveness around the environment.
Yeah, so I think what Mr. Faust is talking about is this disconnect. We have all these big rivers running right through the middle of American cities, and yet we're wringing our hands over the immigrant hordes that are piled up in that city. Well, these guys were really concerned with the West, right? The Missouri River, really from St. Louis west. That's what they were really concerned about. They saw opening the West in these ways with water as a way of relieving pressure on all those people in the cities. Like if we build an irrigation project, they will come. But in fact, it never worked like that. And most of it was just rhetoric. It was just blowing hot air. William Smythe is a perfect example of that. He had all these great ideas about Jeffersonian farming, the Jeffersonian yeoman farmer, but he never, not once, ever helped anybody become a Jeffersonian yeoman farmer. Does that answer your question?
Well, but was there ever a movement at that time that looked at the rivers that ran through those cities?
Only in terms of John, when we talk about John Neihardt and the river improvement thing, but that wasn't really that really wasn't to increase individual initiative or individual opportunity. It was to standardize the river so that they could carry more freight. There's a whole history of river travel in the United States. Real quick, in the Missouri, we had river travel steamboats on the Missouri from about the 1830s through to the end of the 1870s. Then after that, the river became sort of not used, right? Short trips with certain steamboats to areas that didn't have rail connections. What they really wanted then was to form the river to modern technology rather than figuring out technologies that would work with the river as it stood. And in doing that, they said, you've heard it before, right? If we do this, we're going to increase jobs, right? Whenever anybody wants to do something, they pull jobs out of their pocket. And we all sort of clamor and go, ooh, ah, about jobs. But that's how they brought it out. It was like, if we make Kansas City, the port of Kansas City, available to deep draft barges, we're going to be able to unload and offload all kinds of grain and products through the city and create jobs. And in fact, that's never really happened. So I hope that that's a better answer for your question. Yes?
You talked about Neihardt running this river in 1911?
1910.
1910. And Blackout Speaks, which you mentioned, is like 20-some years later. What I remember of that book was that he really kind of indicts technology and industrial capitalism. So does this indicate to you Neihardt changes his mind in the 20 years?
I think that Neihardt, in 1910, he's 27, he's 29 years old, starting out his career, and I think that you can change your view over time. And after 1910, he got into some very close relations with the Omaha Indians near Macy, Nebraska, and actually was inducted as a member of the tribe at some point, as well as an honorary member of the tribe. So he began to become, he had also done some work in the teens as a trader, as an Indian trader, with the Omaha and Winnebago Indians in Nebraska. And I think that as he drew closer to those people, his critique of modern American society becomes sharper. How about any of the students over here? We got students over there. There's nobody to ask a question. Yes?
No, I'm just waiting.
Oh, thank you very much. Makes me feel wanted and needed, which is what all academics really want.
So Slide and Roosevelt and Newlands personally knew each other.
They all knew each other. That's right.
But Neihardt, they only knew up through his writing.
Right. Right.
How faithfully did Neihardt portray the upper Missouri above the first dam in eastern Montana, based on your traversing that part of the river 80 years later?
His route and my route really crossed in the area between the Canyon Ferry Dam and the first dam at Great Falls. When he went through, he had to portage around the Great Falls, but he didn't. There wasn't a hydroelectric dam there. I was actually able to relive some of the tale for him, but again, I wish I could have used these slides to better purposes. But he's living the life up there in western Montana, and his, he got to ride on a freer flowing river than I did. By the time 1905, 1910 rolls around, by the time The River and I comes out in book form, there's already a dam up on the very first fall at Great Falls. So we begin to see the Missouri River begin to be dammed and controlled. So I never fooled myself. I didn't say to myself, I'm on this pristine, like he would always talk about the pristine river and all that. I never fooled myself about that. It wasn't a pristine river. There were dams on it before I got on it. It was controlled after I went around the dams and so on and so on. Yes?
So in an earlier question, you mentioned how kind of the overuse and abuse of these rivers for industrial purpose was in violation of treaties with neighboring countries.
Well, with Mexico and the Colorado River, that's the one that I can speak on, not with a lot of authority, but I know a little bit about it.
So how do you suspect that disparity will be resolved?
Well, it's always trying to be resolved. I mean, the problem with the Colorado River is that it's a mountain river that feeds off a snowpack, and it doesn't snow the same amount every year, right? It doesn't always have the same amount of water in it. Those lakes rise and fall depending on drought conditions or conditions of heavy precipitation. So the conditions are constantly changing and trying to figure out what you can, like if I say a lot, 100 gallons of water, that's all that's in the Colorado River is 100 gallons of water on average, and I allot 100 gallons. Well, when there's only 80 flowing, then there are people who still want their 100 gallons, right? If there's 150 flowing, then Mexico gets its bit, right? But that's how that, the river as it enters Mexico is essentially a salt river because it's been used and reused so much for irrigation. We're actually returning irrigation runoff to Mexico rather than actual water from the river for the most part. Because by the time the river gets to Mexico, it's disappeared into the sand. Yeah, that's on an average. Yes.
Were events such as the overhunting of the American bison, was that a leading cause, like was that one of the main factors of hunting regulations going into effect?
There's a bunch, I don't want to say yes, because yes, that's part of it. But no, there's a lot more going on. I mean, people like Madison Grant and George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt are really worried about these, I should say, big game wildlife, not because, I mean, in Madison Grant's case, he really was wanting to preserve buffalo for buffalo's sake, right? But he really wanted to use the buffalo as an example of what a real society could be like and how our society was going off the rails, right? If we bred right, if we allowed the young to die, if we allowed the sick to go to the wayside, then we would be able to preserve our strong species, right? But he got together with Grinnell and Pinchot and Roosevelt and the Boone and Crockett Club, which was one of the premier conservation organizations at the time. And they lobbied heavily in Congress for game laws, in part to preserve species, but in part also to, I mean, it's one of the things that when we talk about conservation today, frequently we conflate conservationism and environmentalism in the same pocket. That's really, conservationism is management of wildlife. And most of what we talk about in terms of environmentalism is trying to leave things alone or getting to a point where we're leaving things alone. So to answer your question, yes, preserve the buffalo, but also, yes, preserve ducks and deer and all different kinds of things. There was hundreds and hundreds of conservationist organizations, each lobbying for their idea of what should go on in the natural environment. But you got to remember, too, that once we begin to make these laws, there are actual people who are making their livings out there. There are actual people living in rural areas who depend on this wildlife. And suddenly, we're sort of blocking those people off so that we can have enough bison to shoot, or enough deer to shoot, or enough ducks to shoot, right? So we're getting rid of, we're streamlining our behavior in the environment. Anybody else? I really want to thank you for the opportunity, for being here for me tonight. I also appreciate the patience that you put into listening to me read my presentation. Thanks for being here for me tonight. Y'all have done a great job. Give yourself a round of applause.